March 18, 1944. Somewhere over northern France. The German fighter pilot from Munich had seen plenty of American bombers in his 3 years of combat. B-17s, B-24s, even the new B-29s he'd heard about. But this one looked different, stubbier, almost ugly compared to the sleek flying fortresses. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio, laughing about the pregnant duck approaching their sector. The American B-25 Mitchell bomber flew alone, separated from its squadron, limping along at 8,000 feet with one engine smoking. Easy meat for two Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The pilot from Munich smiled beneath his oxygen mask. Another kill to paint on his fuselage. He'd already downed 6 bombers, and this would be the easiest yet. He waggled his wings to signal his wingman, then pushed the stick forward, diving from 12,000 feet. The American bomber grew larger in his gun sight. Strange, though, the nose looked different from other bombers. Instead of the usual greenhouse nose for the bombardier, this one had a solid front, painted olive drab. Multiple dark holes dotted the nose cone. Gun ports, he realized. But how many could they possibly fit in that small space? Lieutenant Jack Morrison from Akron, Ohio, watched the 2 German fighters beginning their dive through his top turret. 26 years old, married 14 months, with a baby girl he'd never seen except in photographs. The B-25J Mitchell they flew had been modified in ways the Germans hadn't encountered yet. The Army Air Forces had learned hard lessons over Europe. Bomber crews needed more firepower, especially for head-on attacks. So they'd done something radical. They'd removed the bombardier's position entirely and packed the nose with machine guns. Not 2, not 4, not even 8. 12 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, plus 2 more in blisters on each side of the fuselage. Morrison keyed the intercom. The pilot, Captain Bill Anderson from Cedar Rapids, had already seen them. So had Sergeant Tony Russo from Brooklyn, manning the nose guns. Russo was 22, had been a butcher's apprentice before the war, and possessed the steadiest hands Morrison had ever seen. Those hands now gripped the controls for 12 synchronized machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's 9,600 rounds per minute of half-inch lead projectiles, all converging at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. The German pilot from Munich had performed this attack dozens of times. Dive from above, come in fast at a 15-degree angle, fire a burst at 500 yards, break away at 200 yards. The closing speed would be over 500 miles per hour, too fast for the bomber's gunners to track effectively. He'd seen American gunners panic, spraying rounds wildly into empty air. This would be no different. At 800 yards, he lined up his approach. The bomber hadn't changed course. Good. They were scared, frozen. At 600 yards, he prepared to squeeze the trigger. That's when he noticed something odd. Small flashes from the bomber's nose. Not 2 or 4, but a constellation of muzzle flashes. Then the air in front of him turned solid. That's the only way to describe what 12 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns do to the space in front of them. The tracer rounds, every 5th bullet, created lines of light so dense they appeared as a solid wall of orange fire. Between each visible tracer were 4 more invisible rounds. The German pilot had perhaps half a second to process this before the first rounds reached him. A 50-caliber bullet is half an inch in diameter and weighs about 1.5 ounces. When it leaves the barrel, it's traveling at 2,900 feet per second. At 300 yards, it still has enough energy to punch through an inch of steel plate. The Messerschmitt's armor was designed to protect against 30-caliber rounds from defensive positions. Not this. The first burst caught the German fighter in the engine. 3 rounds penetrated the engine block simultaneously. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. 2 more rounds shattered the propeller hub. Another punched through the cockpit floor, missing the pilot's legs by inches. The engine seized immediately, the propeller windmilling uselessly. The pilot from Munich had been in combat long enough to know when he was beaten. He rolled inverted and dove away, trailing black smoke, looking for a place to put down. His wingman, watching from above, couldn't believe what he'd witnessed. The American bomber had created a cone of death extending 300 yards from its nose. Not scattered defensive fire, but a concentrated stream that no fighter could fly through and survive. He pulled up hard, climbing back to altitude. Let someone else deal with this monster. In the B-25's nose compartment, Sergeant Russo watched the German fighter diving away. His hands hadn't even started sweating yet. The whole engagement had lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds of absolute concentrated firepower that had turned the predator into prey. The 12 guns had fired perhaps 800 rounds total. They carried 4,000 rounds for the nose guns alone. Plenty left for anyone else who wanted to try. The modification had been Captain Anderson's idea, based on reports from the Pacific where B-25s were being used for low-level strafing attacks against Japanese shipping. Take out the bombardier position, they had dedicated bombers for that role anyway, and turn the Mitchell into a flying gunship. The nose could accommodate 8 50 caliber guns in the compartment, plus 4 more inside packages attached to the fuselage cheeks. Add the 2 guns in the top turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, and you had 18 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. Nothing in the Luftwaffe's arsenal was designed to handle that kind of firepower. Anderson checked his instruments. The number 2 engine was still running rough from flak damage they'd taken over the target, but it would hold. They'd gotten separated from their squadron during a German fighter attack near Rams. Now they were alone, trying to make it back to England on 1.5 engines. The encounter with the 2 Messerschmitts would be reported, he knew. Within hours, every German fighter squadron in France would know about the B-25 with the solid nose and the wall of lead. 3 days later, Major Klaus Steinberg from Hamburg didn't believe the reports. He'd been flying combat missions since the Battle of Britain, had over 200 combat sorties and 43 confirmed kills. He knew American bombers, knew their weaknesses. The report claimed a single B-25 had driven off 2 experienced pilots with something called a solid nose gun package. Propaganda, he figured. Or maybe the 2 pilots had simply been inexperienced, frightened by a lucky burst of defensive fire. He was leading a flight of 4 Focke-Wulf 190s on patrol near Abbeville when they spotted a formation of American bombers returning from a raid on railroad yards in Belgium. B-26 Marauders, mostly, flying in their standard box formation at 15,000 feet. But trailing behind, lower and slower, was a single B-25. Steinberg smiled. This would be a good opportunity to show the younger pilots how to properly attack a wounded bomber. The Mitchell was flying at 12,000 feet, both engines running but clearly struggling to maintain altitude. Steinberg could see the tail number, see the olive drab paint worn down to bare metal in places from hundreds of hours of combat flying. The crew had to be exhausted, probably low on ammunition, after their bombing run. He signaled his flight. He would attack first from the front quarter, demonstrate the proper technique, then the others could finish it off. Staff Sergeant Ray Kowalski from Pittsburgh was manning the top turret, scanning the sky constantly. 24 years old, built like a linebacker, had worked in the steel mills before enlisting. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 months, had seen friends' planes explode, had watched crews floating down in parachutes over enemy territory. He knew the statistics. Average life expectancy for a bomber crew was 15 missions. They were on their 31st. He spotted the 4 German fighters high and to the right, maybe 3 miles out, and climbing for altitude. The sick feeling in his stomach had nothing to do with the turbulence. 4 fighters against 1 damaged bomber rarely ended well. But their B-25J wasn't just any bomber. They'd proven that over and over in the past 2 months. The modifications had turned them from prey into something else entirely. Not quite Predator, but certainly not an easy target. Captain Mike Thompson from Denver was flying this mission, Anderson's regular replacement when he was on leave. Thompson was older, 31, had been a crop duster before the war. He had hands like a surgeon and nerves that simply didn't exist. When Kowalski reported the fighters, Thompson's voice over the intercom sounded like he was discussing the weather. He told the nose gunner, Corporal Jim Sullivan from Boston, to ready the nose battery. Sullivan was 19, youngest man on the crew, with reflexes that made him deadly on the gun controls. Major Steinberg began his attack run from 2 o'clock high, the classic position that gave him speed and angle while making it difficult for the bomber's guns to track. He'd approach at a 30-degree angle, fire his cannons at 400 yards, then break away. The Focke-Wulf's 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns would tear the Mitchell apart. He pushed the stick forward, entering a shallow dive, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The bomber grew in his windscreen. At 1,000 yards, he saw the Mitchell's nose. Solid, just like the report had said, multiple gun ports visible. So the story was true. They had modified the nose. No matter. Even 8 machine guns couldn't create enough firepower to stop a properly executed fighter attack. At 600 yards, he prepared to fire. That's when Sullivan opened up. The sensation was like flying into a thunderstorm made of lead. The tracer rounds created a tunnel of light that Steinberg seemed to be flying directly into. His windscreen starred in 5 places simultaneously. Something hammered into his left wing, then his right. The control stick shook in his hands. A round punched through the canopy, showering him with plexiglass. Another destroyed his gun sight. 2 more rounds hit the engine, and immediately he smelled smoke. Training took over. Steinberg rolled hard left, diving away from that incredible stream of fire. In his entire combat career, he'd never experienced anything like it. The American bomber had turned the air in front of it into a killing zone. His Focke-Wulf had taken at least a dozen hits in less than 2 seconds. Oil pressure dropping, engine temperature rising, smoke filling the cockpit. He jettisoned the canopy and prepared to bail out. The 3 remaining German fighters watched their leader's aircraft falling away, trailing smoke and flames. The major's parachute blossomed white against the green French countryside below. They'd all seen the wall of tracers, the impossible density of fire the bomber had produced. The flight leader's wingman, a young lieutenant from Berlin on his 5th combat mission, felt his mouth go dry. He'd been taught that American bombers were defensive, that they could only react to attacks. This was something different. This bomber could attack them. Thompson kept the Mitchell steady, watching the 3 remaining fighters circling at a respectful distance. They were staying outside of effective gun range, probably discussing what to do. He knew they'd try again. German pilots were nothing if not determined. But they'd be more careful now, probably try to coordinate, attack from multiple angles simultaneously. That was fine. The B-25J had guns pointing in every direction. Let them come. The 3 Germans did exactly what Thompson expected. They split up, climbing to different altitudes, positioning for a coordinated attack. 1 high, 1 level, 1 low. They'd try to overwhelm the bomber's defenses, force the gunners to choose targets. It was a good tactic against a standard bomber. But the Mitchell's nose guns could engage multiple targets in rapid sequence, and they still had the top turret, waist guns, and tail position fully manned. They came in together, 3 fighters boring in from different angles. Sullivan engaged the high fighter first, sending a stream of lead into its path. The German pilot, seeing the tracers reaching for him, broke off early, his shots going wide. Kowalski in the top turret took the level fighter, his twin 50s hammering away. The waist gunner, Sergeant Paul Martinez from San Antonio, handled the low attacker. For 15 seconds, the air around the B-25 was filled with crossing tracers, the bomber at the center of a web of fire. When it was over, all 3 German fighters had disengaged without pressing their attacks. One was trailing smoke, another had a windscreen so shot up the pilot could barely see. They'd managed to put maybe 20 rounds into the Mitchell, mostly small caliber, nothing critical. The bomber had fired over 2,000 rounds and was still flying, still dangerous. The three German pilots looked at each other through their canopies and, without a word being spoken, turned east and headed home. Let someone else deal with this flying fortress of guns. Word spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire. The Americans had created a monster, a bomber that could defend itself with unprecedented firepower. Within a week, standing orders were issued. B-25s, with solid noses, were to be engaged only with superior numbers and extreme caution. Better to let them pass than lose fighters to that wall of lead. But not everyone got the message, or chose to believe it. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber from Stuttgart was 22 years old, had been flying combat for only 3 months, and had yet to score his first kill. When he spotted a lone B-25 over Normandy on April 2, 1944, he saw opportunity. His flight leader had warned him about the modified Mitchells, but Weber figured the stories were exaggerated. No bomber could carry that much firepower. He peeled off from his formation and dove to attack. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak from Cleveland was manning the nose guns that day. 27 years old, had been a machinist before the war, understood mechanical systems the way some people understood music. He'd personally supervised the installation and alignment of their 12-nose guns, had spent hours adjusting the convergence point until all 12 streams of bullets met at exactly 350 yards. He'd painted a small sign above his gun position, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Novak watched the single German fighter beginning its run. Young pilot, he could tell by the approach, too steep, too fast. No deception. The kid was trying to make his bones with an easy kill. Novak almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He waited until the fighter was at 400 yards, then squeezed the trigger. The 12 guns roared in unison, the vibration shaking the entire nose compartment. The tracer streams converged perfectly, creating a cone of destruction that the German fighter flew directly into. Weber had perhaps a quarter second to realize his fatal mistake. The concentrated fire tore his Messerschmitt apart like paper. The left wing separated first, then the tail. The engine exploded. The cockpit disintegrated. What had been a fighter plane became a cloud of aluminum confetti falling toward the French countryside. Weber never had a chance to bail out. Captain Anderson, back from leave and flying this mission, watched the destruction in his mirror. He'd seen their nose guns in action dozens of times now, but it still amazed him. 1250 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a level of firepower that belonged on a naval vessel, not an aircraft. Each gun was precisely aligned, their combined rate of fire creating a stream of bullets so dense that nothing could survive flying through it. They'd turned the B-25 from a medium bomber into something entirely new, a gunship that happened to carry bombs. The modifications hadn't been without cost. The 12 nose guns and their ammunition weighed over 2,000 pounds. The Mitchell's bomb load had to be reduced, and fuel consumption increased. The guns generated so much heat when fired that special ventilation had to be installed to keep the nose compartment from becoming an oven. The recoil from all 12 guns firing could actually slow the bomber's airspeed by 10 miles per hour. But none of that mattered when you could create a wall of lead that no fighter pilot wanted to challenge. By May 1944, the modified B-25Js had become legend among both American and German pilots. American fighter escorts would deliberately leave gaps in their coverage around the gunship Mitchells, knowing they could take care of themselves. German pilots would radio warnings when they spotted the solid-nose variants, often choosing easier targets. The kill ratio was remarkable. In 3 months of operations, the gunship B-25s had shot down or damaged over 40 German fighters while losing only 2 of their own number. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hoffman from Milwaukee, commanding the 447th Bombardment Squadron, had pushed hard for more conversions. His report to 8th Air Force Headquarters was blunt. The B-25J gunship configuration has proven that the best defense is overwhelming offense. German fighter pilots have learned to fear these aircraft, request immediate conversion of all available B-25s to gunship configuration. The request was denied. The modifications were expensive and time-consuming. The added weight affected range and bomb load. The Army Air Forces needed bombers that could bomb, not just gunships. But Hoffman's squadron kept their modified Mitchells and kept proving their worth on every mission. May 15, 1944. Over the Pas de Calais, Captain Ernst Müller from Cologne led a squadron of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, all experienced pilots with multiple kills. They'd been vectored to intercept a formation of American bombers heading for V-1 launch sites along the French coast. Müller had 38 confirmed kills, was considered one of the Luftwaffe's best bomber killers. He knew about the modified B-25s, had read the reports, had even spoken to pilots who'd encountered them. He believed the threat was real but manageable with proper tactics. The American formation appeared through broken clouds at 14,000 feet. B-26, Marauders in the lead, B-25s trailing. Müller studied them through his binoculars, identifying 3 solid nose variants among the regular Mitchells. He formulated his plan: ignore the gunships, focus on the standard bombers and the Marauders. No need to tangle with the flying fortresses of guns when easier targets were available, but Sergeant Danny O'Brien from South Boston, manning the nose guns in one of the B-25Js, had other ideas. 23 years old, red hair and freckles, with a temperament that matched the stereotype. He'd grown up in the rough neighborhoods where you learned to hit first and hit hard. When he saw the German fighters positioning to attack the other bombers, ignoring his Mitchell, it offended him on a personal level. They were dismissing him, treating him as not worth their attention. He'd show them different. O'Brien convinced his pilot, Lieutenant Tom Washington from Tallahassee, to break formation slightly, to angle toward the German fighters. Not an attack run exactly, but positioning to put them within range of the nose guns if the Germans came after the other bombers. Washington was 28, had been a math teacher before the war, understood angles and vectors better than most. He saw what O'Brien wanted to do and agreed. They could provide covering fire for the other bombers, use their massive firepower defensively. Müller noticed the B-25 edging out of formation, but didn't initially understand why. When he led his fighters in against a group of standard Mitchells, he found out. O'Brien opened up at maximum range, 800 yards, walking his streams of tracers across the path of the attacking fighters. The Germans had never expected to take fire from a bomber that wasn't even being attacked. The psychological effect was immediate. Seeing that wall of lead reaching out toward them, even at long range, caused 3 pilots to break off their attacks prematurely. One German pilot, younger and more aggressive, pressed his attack anyway. As he closed on his target, O'Brien shifted fire, all 12 guns swiveling slightly to track the fighter. At 500 yards, the accuracy improved dramatically. Rounds started striking the Messerschmitt. Not many at first, but enough to get the pilot's attention. By 400 yards, the fighter was taking multiple hits. The pilot broke off, diving away with smoke streaming from his engine. He'd never even gotten within effective firing range of his target. The engagement lasted less than a minute, but it changed everything. Müller realized the Americans had turned these gunship B-25s into something like aerial destroyers, protecting the bomber fleet the way naval destroyers protected convoys. They didn't have to wait to be attacked. They could reach out and touch any fighter that threatened the formation. The 12 nose guns gave them a reach and hitting power that no fighter pilot wanted to test. 3 days later, the Luftwaffe issued new tactical guidelines. B-25s with solid nose configurations were to be classified as heavy defensive platforms and engaged only when absolutely necessary. The preferred tactic was to avoid them entirely, focusing on other targets. If engagement was unavoidable, attacks should be made from directly above or below, outside the cone of fire from the nose guns. Even then, pilots were warned to expect heavy defensive fire from other positions. But the Americans kept improving their tactics too. The gunship Mitchells started flying in specific positions within formations, placed where their nose guns could cover the maximum number of other bombers. They became the shepherds of the bomber fleet, the guards that kept the wolves at bay. German fighter pilots learned to recognize them from miles away, that distinctive solid nose becoming a warning sign that said, "Find another target." Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez from El Paso had a different job on the B-25J crew. As the flight engineer, he kept the guns running. 25 years old, had been a mechanic in his father's garage before the war. The 12 nose guns were temperamental beasts, prone to jamming if not properly maintained. Each gun fired at a slightly different rate, which could create harmonic vibrations that would shake mountings loose. The heat from sustained firing could warp barrels, cause ammunition to cook off, even start fires if hydraulic fluid leaked onto hot metal. Rodriguez had developed a maintenance routine that bordered on obsessive. Every gun was cleaned and checked after every mission. He personally inspected each ammunition belt, looking for damaged rounds that could cause jams. He adjusted the gun mountings daily, compensating for the metal fatigue caused by vibration. He'd even developed a firing sequence that O'Brien could use to prevent overheating. Fire 8 guns for 3 seconds, then switch to the other 4 while the first 8 cooled. Then back to all 12 for the kill shot. His attention to detail paid off on May 28, 1944. They were over Saint-Omer when they encountered something new, a full squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s specifically hunting for gunship B-25s. The Germans had developed new tactics, approaching in waves from multiple angles, trying to overwhelm the defensive firepower. The first wave came in high and fast, 4 fighters in trail formation. O'Brien engaged at maximum range, forcing them to alter their approach. But while the nose guns were occupied, another 4 fighters attacked from beam positions. This was where the B-25J's full armament came into play. While O'Brien handled the high attackers with the nose guns, the top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Patterson from Detroit, engaged the beam attackers with his twin 50s. The waist gunners, Corporal Tim Lee from San Francisco and Corporal Bobby Jackson from Atlanta, added their fire. The tail gunner, Sergeant Mario Benedetti from Newark, watched for anyone trying to sneak in from behind. The Mitchell became a sphere of flying lead, guns firing in every direction. The German fighters pressed their attacks with determination, but the volume of defensive fire was simply overwhelming. One Focke-Wulf took a burst from the nose guns that removed most of its right wing. Another had its cockpit shattered by fire from the top turret. A third pulled away with both engines on fire after flying through the combined fire of both waist positions. In 90 seconds of combat, the single B-25 had shot down 2 fighters and damaged 3 more, while taking only minor damage itself. But the Germans were learning, too. On June 6, 1944, D-Day. While the world's attention focused on the beaches of Normandy, Captain Hans Richter from Vienna led an experimental attack against a gunship Mitchell. He'd studied every after-action report, analyzed the geometry of the nose gun coverage, and identified what he believed was a blind spot. If approached from directly below at a 70-degree angle, the nose guns couldn't depress enough to engage. The belly of the B-25 was relatively undefended, with no gun positions covering that angle. Richter's theory was tested over Caen. He spotted a lone B-25J struggling back from a mission, one engine feathered, falling behind its formation, perfect target to test his approach. He dove below the bomber's altitude, then pulled up sharply from directly underneath. The nose guns couldn't bear on him. The top turret couldn't depress that far. The waist guns had limited downward visibility. For a few seconds, he had a clear shot at the bomber's belly. His cannon shells tore into the Mitchell's underside, puncturing fuel tanks, severing control cables. The bomber shuddered, began losing altitude. Richter pulled away, expecting to see it going down. But the crew of that B-25J wasn't ready to quit. Lieutenant Colonel James Foster from Richmond was flying that day, 42 years old, the oldest pilot in the squadron. He'd been flying since 1925, had more hours in his logbook than most pilots had in their lives. He'd felt the hits, knew they were bad, but also knew that B-25s were tough birds. Foster managed to keep the Mitchell in the air through pure skill and determination. He'd lost rudder control, had fuel streaming from punctured tanks, and the remaining engine was overheating. But they were only 40 miles from the emergency field at Tangmere. He ordered the crew to prepare for crash landing while he nursed the dying bomber home. O'Brien stayed at the nose guns, ready to discourage any fighter that might try to finish them off. Rodriguez worked frantically to transfer fuel from the punctured tanks, trying to prevent fire. They made it to Tangmere on fumes and prayer. Foster brought the Mitchell in hot, no flaps, no rudder, using differential engine power and aileron to maintain something resembling controlled flight. They hit hard, bounced twice, ground-looped when the left gear collapsed, and came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. The crew evacuated quickly, expecting fire, but Rodriguez's fuel transfer had worked. They all walked away. The Mitchell was written off, but it had survived an attack that should have killed it, brought its crew home against impossible odds. Richter's report on the successful attack method spread through the Luftwaffe, but it came with a warning. The attack required perfect execution and iron nerves. You had to fly directly under the bomber's guns, trust that you were in the blind spot, pull up at exactly the right angle, and score hits in the few seconds you had before the bomber's gunners adjusted. Most pilots who tried it found that the nose gunner could depress the guns just a bit more than expected, or the top turret could track just a bit faster, or the waist gunners were just a bit more alert. The price of imperfect execution was flying into 1250 caliber machine guns at point-blank range. By July 1944, the gunship B-25s had become part of the 8th Air Force's Mythology. Crews requested assignment to them despite the reduced bomb load. Fighter escorts would radio greetings when they spotted the distinctive solid noses. Ground crews painted elaborate nose art celebrating the firepower. Dragons breathing lead, Gatling guns with wings, the Grim Reaper holding a dozen scythes. One Mitchell named Leadstorm had 43 small German crosses painted below the cockpit, each representing a fighter destroyed or damaged by its guns. The German pilots had their own name for them, Holland Maschinen, Hell Machines. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated that engaging a gunship B-25 head-on was 12 times more dangerous than attacking a standard B-17 from the same angle. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A B-17's nose had two 50 caliber guns, maybe 4 if you counted the top turret able to fire forward. The B-25J had 14 guns that could fire forward, the 12 in, the nose plus the top turret. That was 7 times the firepower in a much more concentrated arc. But beyond the mathematics was the psychological impact. Sergeant Willie Turner from Birmingham, tail gunner on a B-25J called Alabama Hammer, described it best in a letter home. He was 21, had been a coal miner before the war, knew about danger and fear. "The German fighters are afraid of us now," he wrote. "You can see it in how they fly. They come in all aggressive. Then they see our nose, see all those gun barrels, and they hesitate. That hesitation is all we need." Danny opens up with the nose guns, and suddenly the fighter is running away, not even trying to shoot back. We've become the thing they check for before attacking anyone else. The fear was justified. On July 18, 1944, a single B-25J shot down 4 German fighters in one mission. The bomber, nicknamed Seattle Slugger, was flown by Major Robert Chen from San Francisco, one of the few Chinese-American pilots in the European theater. His nose gunner, Sergeant Bill Garrett from Louisville, had developed an almost supernatural ability to lead targets. The 4 kills came in 2 separate engagements, each time with German fighters trying to test whether the gunship's reputation was deserved. The first two were Bf-109s that tried a coordinated attack from 1 o'clock high. Garrett engaged the lead fighter at 600 yards, walking his tracers into its path. The German pilot, seeing the wall of lead coming, tried to roll away, but flew directly into the stream. The concentrated fire sawed through the fighter's fuselage just behind the cockpit. The tail section separated completely, the rest of the aircraft tumbling out of control. The second 109, witnessing his leader's destruction, broke off without firing a shot, but made the mistake of crossing in front of the B-25. Garrett shifted fire smoothly, catching the fighter broadside. 12 .50 caliber guns at 300 yards turned the Messerschmitt into scrap metal in less than 2 seconds. The second engagement came near the target, railway yards at Amiens. Two Focke-Wulf 190s bounced the formation from above, diving through the top cover. One lined up on Seattle Slugger, probably not recognizing it as a gunship variant until too late. Garrett opened fire at maximum range, creating his signature wall of lead. The German pilot, committed to his dive, tried to barrel through. 500 yards, 400, 300. The tracers were hitting now, sparking off the fighter's engine cowling, shattering the canopy. At 200 yards, the Focke-Wulf's engine exploded. The pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just as his fighter plowed into a French wheat field. The fourth kill was almost accidental. A damaged 109, trying to disengage from another bomber, flew across Seattle Slugger's nose at about 400 yards. Garrett fired a short burst, more warning than attack, but with 12 guns firing, even a short burst meant 200 rounds. The fighter took at least 20 hits, began streaming glycol from its cooling system. The pilot immediately dove for the deck, looking for somewhere to put down. He didn't make it. The engine seized 2 miles later, forcing him to bail out at low altitude. His parachute barely had time to deploy. Major Chen's after-action report was matter of fact. Engaged enemy fighters, 4 destroyed, no damage to aircraft, returning to base. But the impact rippled through both air forces. 4 kills by a single bomber in one mission was almost unheard of. The gunship B-25s weren't just defending themselves anymore, they were actively hunting fighters that came too close. The Luftwaffe's response was to essentially declare the gunship B-25s off-limits, unless absolutely necessary. A directive dated July 22, 1944, instructed fighter pilots to avoid engagement with B-25 aircraft exhibiting solid nose configuration unless specifically ordered or when no alternative targets are available. It was an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that some American bombers were simply too dangerous to attack. But war doesn't always allow for choosing your battles. On August 3, 1944, Lieutenant Wolfgang Becker from Dusseldorf found himself alone, separated from his squadron, low on fuel, with a B-25J directly in his path back to base. 20 years old, on his 8th combat mission, Becker had never encountered a gunship Mitchell before. He'd heard the stories but figured he had no choice. He needed to get past the bomber to reach his airfield. Maybe he could dash underneath it, avoid those famous nose guns. Corporal Johnny Washington from Memphis was manning the nose guns that day, substituting for O'Brien, who was down with food poisoning. 19 years old, Washington had been a saxophone player in a jazz band before the war. He had musician's hands, long, delicate fingers that could coax melodies from brass or, as he'd discovered, death from machine guns. He had an almost musical sense of timing, understanding rhythm and lead in ways that couldn't be taught. Washington watched the lone German fighter approaching at low altitude, clearly trying to slip underneath them. He depressed the nose guns as far as they would go, but the angle was wrong. The fighter would pass below their field of fire. He called it out to the pilot, Captain Steve Anderson from Portland. Anderson, without hesitation, pushed the Mitchell's nose down, diving to give Washington a better angle. It was a risky move, diving toward an enemy fighter, but it worked. Suddenly, the German fighter wasn't passing safely below, but was directly in the cone of fire from the nose guns. Washington opened up at 300 yards, all 12 guns roaring. The concentrated fire created a curtain of lead that the fighter flew directly into. Becker's Messerschmitt came apart like it had hit an invisible wall. The engine separated from the fuselage. Both wings folded backward. The cockpit disintegrated. What had been a fighter became a cloud of debris falling into the English Channel. Becker never knew what hit him. The kill was Washington's first and only. 2 days later, he was transferred to another crew after O'Brien returned to duty. But that one engagement earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross and a mention in Stars and Stripes. "Memphis Jazzman plays deadly tune on Nazi fighter," read the headline, the kind of story that built the legend of the gunship Mitchells even higher. By late August 1944, with the Allies breaking out from Normandy and racing across France, the role of the B-25 gunships began to change. With fewer German fighters challenging the bomber streams, the Mitchells were increasingly used for ground attack missions. The 12 nose guns that could destroy a fighter in seconds were equally effective against trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. The gunships would come in low, sometimes only 50 feet off the deck, and unleash their tremendous firepower on German columns trying to retreat eastward. Lieutenant David Kim from Los Angeles, flying a B-25J nicknamed Dragon's Breath, described one such mission in his diary. They caught a German convoy stopped at a crossroads near Falaz, maybe 30 vehicles, including tanks and half-tracks. Kim brought the Mitchell in at treetop height, while his nose gunner, Sergeant Carlos Mendez from San Diego, prepared to engage. At 200 yards, Mendez opened fire with all 12 guns. The effect on the convoy was catastrophic. Trucks exploded, men scattered, even the tank's crews abandoned their vehicles rather than face that concentrated fire. In one pass, lasting maybe 10 seconds, they destroyed or damaged half the convoy. But the Germans weren't passive victims. They learned to position anti-aircraft guns specifically to catch the low-flying gunships. On September 2, 1944, Hell's 12, a B-25J that had survived 43 missions, was caught by concentrated flak near Metz. The nose compartment, where Sergeant Tony Palmer from Chicago manned the 12 guns, took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. Palmer was killed instantly, the nose guns destroyed. Without their primary armament, the Mitchell was just another medium bomber, and a damaged one at that. The pilot, Captain Ben Franklin from Philadelphia, managed to nurse the crippled bomber back to Allied territory, but Hell's 12 never flew again. The loss hit the squadron hard. Every gunship crew knew they were priority targets. The Germans had put bounties on them, promising extra leave to any anti-aircraft crew that brought one down. Fighter pilots who managed to destroy a gunship, Mitchell received immediate Iron Crosses. The solid-nose B-25s had become symbols, proof that American industrial might could create weapons the Germans couldn't match or counter effectively. But they kept flying, kept fighting. On September 15, 1944, during the failed operation, Market Garden B-25 gunships provided close air support for paratroopers trapped at Arnhem. Flying through intense ground fire, they came in at rooftop height, their nose guns suppressing German positions. Sergeant Mike O'Connor from Buffalo, nose gunner on New York Minute, fired over 3,000 rounds in a single mission, his 12 guns helping to clear a path for British paratroopers trying to reach the bridge. The mission cost them. New York Minute took over 100 hits from small arms and light flak. O'Connor was wounded twice, shrapnel in his shoulder and leg, but stayed at his guns. The pilot, Major Tom Wilson from Seattle, flew the last 30 minutes with no hydraulics, barely any control, blood from his own wounds making the controls stick slippery. They made it back to base, counted the holes, counted themselves lucky to be alive. Wilson would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. O'Connor would spend 2 months in the hospital, but would return to flying. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe was largely swept from the skies over Western Europe. The gunship B-25s had played their part in that victory. Official records credited them with 73 confirmed fighter kills and over 100 damaged. Unofficial estimates were much higher, but numbers didn't tell the real story. The real victory was psychological. They'd taken a bomber and turned it into something that fighters feared. They'd reversed the predator-prey relationship that had defined air combat since the beginning of the war. Captain Paul Anderson from Minnesota, who'd flown 37 missions in a gunship Mitchell, explained it in a letter to his wife. "We changed the rules. For 3 years, fighters hunted bombers. We were always on the defensive, always reacting. Then we put 12 guns in the nose, and suddenly we weren't prey anymore. We were dangerous. We could reach out and touch them before they could touch us. You could see it in their eyes. Not that we could actually see their eyes, but you know what I mean? They'd come in all aggressive, and then they'd see our nose, see all those guns, and they'd hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is death." The ground crews understood the significance, too. Master Sergeant Roy White from Dallas, crew chief for Texas Thunder, had been working on bombers since 1942. "These gunship Mitchells," he said, "they were different. Regular bombers, you're always patching holes, fixing damage from fighter attacks. But the gunships, they came back clean more often than not. The fighters just wouldn't engage them. And when they did, well, we'd be painting another kill mark on the nose instead of patching bullet holes." November 1944 brought new challenges. The Germans, in desperation, had introduced jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me 262. These aircraft were 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. The conventional wisdom was that the jets were unstoppable, that no amount of defensive firepower could counter their speed advantage. The gunship crews weren't so sure. On November 28, 1944, they got their chance to find out. Captain Jack Thompson from Denver was flying Colorado Crusher on a mission to bomb rail yards near Frankfurt when 2 Me-262s appeared. The jets made a high-speed pass at the formation, their cannons blazing. Most of the bombers could only watch. The jets were too fast for their gunners to track. But Thompson had positioned his B-25 perfectly, anticipating the jet's attack path. Sergeant Pete Wilson from Portland, manning the nose guns, had maybe 2 seconds to engage. But with 12 guns, 2 seconds was enough. He led the target by what seemed like an impossible distance, firing where the jet would be rather than where it was. The wall of lead intersected perfectly with the Me-262's flight path. The jet flew through the concentrated fire for less than half a second, but that was enough. Multiple .50 caliber rounds struck the jet's right engine. The Me-262 began trailing smoke, its speed advantage gone. The pilot broke off, diving away, trying to make it back to base on one engine. He didn't make it, having to bail out 10 miles short of his airfield. It was the first jet fighter damaged by a B-25 gunship, proving that even the newest German wonder weapons weren't immune to concentrated firepower. The second Me-262 wisely decided not to press its attack, disappearing into the clouds at 600 miles per hour. Wilson would receive the Silver Star for the engagement, the citation noting his exceptional gunnery skills against superior enemy aircraft. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had broken through American lines in the Ardennes, and every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The gunship B-25s were assigned close air support missions, their firepower desperately needed to stop German armored columns. Flying in weather that would normally ground all aircraft, they came in low through snow and fog, their 12 nose guns tearing into German vehicles and troops. On December 23rd, the weather briefly cleared and the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. Captain Bill Roberts from Houston led 3 gunship Mitchells against a German panzer column near Bastogne. They came in line astern, each B-25 firing its nose guns in sequence. The first Mitchell destroyed the lead vehicles, blocking the road. The second hit the fuel trucks in the middle of the column. Roberts, flying the third aircraft, worked over the trapped vehicles, systematically. His nose gunner, Sergeant Jim Davis, from Little Rock, fired over 4,000 rounds in 3 passes. When they were done, 27 German vehicles were burning, the column completely destroyed. But the Germans fought back viciously. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, desperate. Houston Pride, Roberts's aircraft, took massive damage on the 3rd pass. The nose compartment was hit repeatedly, Davis wounded in both arms but still firing. The right engine was shot out, the left wing on fire. Roberts managed to keep the Mitchell airborne long enough to reach American lines, then belly-landed in a snow-covered field. The crew survived. Davis would lose his left arm, but live. Houston Pride was done, another gunship lost to German desperation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. German resistance was crumbling, their air force virtually extinct. The gunship B-25s had done their job, perhaps too well. There were simply no more fighters to shoot down, no more need for their specialized firepower. Some were converted back to standard bomber configuration, others were assigned to ground attack duties, their 12 nose guns used against targets of opportunity. February 12, 1945, marked the last air-to-air kill by a B-25 gunship in the European theater. Brooklyn Brawler, flown by Lieutenant Sam Cohen from New York, encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 near Cologne. The German pilot, probably on one of his first missions, made the fatal error of attacking head-on. Sergeant Mike Murphy from Boston, manning the nose guns, opened fire at 500 yards. The wall of lead was as effective as it had been a year earlier. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated, the pilot killed instantly. It was Murphy's 8th confirmed kill, making him the highest-scoring bomber gunner in the 8th Air Force. March 1945, and the gunship Mitchells were mostly flying milk runs, hitting targets with no opposition. The crews were bored, ready to go home. Some had been flying combat for over a year, had completed 50, 60, even 70 missions. They'd survived when statistics said they shouldn't have, had revolutionized bomber defense, had proven that American innovation could overcome any challenge. Captain Tom Anderson from Iowa, who'd flown more gunship missions than anyone, 48 in total, reflected on what they'd accomplished. We took a medium bomber and turned it into something that scared the hell out of fighter pilots. Think about that. Fighter pilots, the hunters, the predators of the air war, were afraid of us. We reversed the entire dynamic of air combat. When historians write about this war, they'll talk about the B-17s and B-29s, the big strategic bombers. But we changed things too. We proved that the best defense isn't armor or altitude or fighter escort. It's overwhelming firepower, concentrated and well-aimed. April 1945, the war in Europe had weeks left. The surviving gunship B-25s were gathered at bases in France, waiting for orders. Some crews were told they'd be sent to the Pacific, where B-25s were still needed for island-hopping campaigns. Others were simply waiting to go home. The aircraft themselves looked tired, paint worn down to bare metal, patches covering old battle damage, engines running rough after hundreds of hours of combat flying. Sergeant Danny O'Brien, the nose gunner from South Boston who'd started it all, had completed 62 missions. He'd destroyed or damaged 14 enemy aircraft, fired over 100,000 rounds through those 12 nose guns. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "I used to be scared every mission, scared of fighters, scared of flak, scared of dying. Then we got these guns, these beautiful 12 guns, and suddenly the Germans were scared of us. That's what won this war, Ma, not just brave men or smart generals, but making the enemy more scared than we were." May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe was over. The gunship B-25s had played their part, small perhaps in the grand scheme, but significant to those who flew them and faced them. Of the 42 B-25Js converted to gunship configuration in the European theater, 31 survived the war. They'd accounted for at least 73 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, probably twice that many damaged, and countless vehicles, trains, and ground targets obliterated by their tremendous firepower. The crews went home to places like Detroit and Denver, Boston and Birmingham, small towns and big cities across America. Some would fly again in Korea, some would never set foot in an aircraft again. They'd take with them memories of that incredible firepower, the 12 guns roaring in unison, the wall of lead reaching out to touch enemy fighters who'd learned to fear them. The aircraft themselves met various fates. Some were scrapped immediately, their war-weary frames not worth maintaining. Others were converted to trainers or transports. A few ended up in museums, their solid noses a curiosity to visitors who couldn't imagine the fear they'd once inspired. Seattle's Slugger sits in a museum in Washington state, its nose guns still pointing forward, still looking dangerous, even in peaceful retirement. The German pilots who'd faced them had their own memories. In a 1962 interview, former Major Klaus Steinberg, the pilot who'd been shot down by a gunship Mitchell in 1944, recalled, "We laughed when we first heard about them. Bombers with 12 machine guns in the nose. It seemed like American excess, like putting too much chrome on a car. Then I encountered one. The air in front of that bomber turned solid with lead. It was like flying into a wall. I'd faced Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Mustangs. Nothing compared to those B-25s with the solid noses. They didn't just defend themselves, they attacked you with defensive fire. It was brilliant and terrifying." The legacy of the gunship B-25s extends beyond their combat record. They proved that innovation could overcome traditional limitations, that defensive weapons could become offensive tools, that the bomber-fighter dynamic wasn't fixed in stone. They influenced post-war aircraft design, leading to heavily armed gunships like the AC-47 and AC-130 that would dominate battlefields in Vietnam and beyond. But perhaps the greatest legacy was in the minds of the men who flew them. They'd gone to war expecting to be hunted, to be victims needing protection. Instead, they became hunters themselves, predators in bombers' clothing. They'd taken 1250 caliber machine guns and created a psychological weapon as powerful as any bomb. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak, the flight engineer from El Paso who'd kept those 12 guns running, perhaps said it best in a letter to his son years later. "We didn't just fight the Germans, we fought fear itself. Every time those 12 guns opened up, creating that wall of lead, we were saying, 'We're not afraid of you, you should be afraid of us.'" And they were. My God, they were. And that feeling, that moment when the hunters became the hunted, that's what I remember most. Not the killing or the dying, but that moment when we stopped being afraid. The numbers tell one story. 42 aircraft modified, 73 confirmed kills, hundreds of ground targets destroyed, thousands of rounds fired. But the real story was in those moments when German pilots saw that solid nose, saw those 12 dark holes, and decided to find easier prey. The real victory was in making the hunters hesitate, in turning defense into offense, in proving that American ingenuity could take any challenge and turn it into an advantage. Today, only a handful of B-25 gunships survive in museums around the world. Visitors walk past them, maybe read a placard about their armament, take a photo. Few understand what those 12 guns meant, what that solid nose represented. It wasn't just firepower, it was defiance. It was taking a bomber and making it into something that fighter pilots feared. It was American crews saying, "Come at us, we're ready." The last surviving nose gunner from the gunship Mitchells, Mike Murphy from Boston, died in 2019 at age 94. At his funeral, his grandson read from his diary. "They gave us 12 guns and told us to defend ourselves. We did more than that. We made the Germans defend themselves from us. Every time I squeezed that trigger, sending 20 pounds of lead per second into the sky, I was writing a message in tracers. American bombers aren't victims, not anymore. Not with these guns, not with these crews. We changed the game, and the Germans never recovered from that change. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.